Hey there, everyone. Today I would like to discuss Stanley Fish's essay, Literature in the Reader, Affective Stylistics. This is a crucial piece of poststructuralist reader response theory, where Fish is really going to lay out the implications of poststructuralism for how we approach texts. And in particular, he's going to be focusing not on what texts mean, but what they do, and that their meaning is what they do. That, as he says, reading is an activity, something you do, and the text, too, is something that we interact with actively. Thus, he is going to try to be concerned with all the parameters concerning the reading experience and concerning reading as an experience, not as something where we can bracket certain facts about our mediating role as a reader, but instead we can try to fully take into account the contextual aspects that are the preconditions for reading at all. This is a really crucial essay for understanding the implications of all sorts of cultural and geographic and religious factors when it comes to reading any text, and this is going to be really important for post-colonial theory, for feminist theory, for phenomenology, for post-structuralist theorists more broadly. Here, Fish is theorizing a method of analysis which takes the reader as an actively mediating presence fully into account, and which, therefore, has as its focus the psychological effects of the utterance. So key for us here is that literature and meaning is an effect. It is something we receive, and therefore it is part of a larger temporal process. It is progressive, and it is concerned with expectations and our relationships to a text. He says that you can't get a fact out of it which could serve as an answer to any one of these questions, but rather there must always be a problematical sense as a statement makes perfect sense as a strategy, as an action made upon a reader rather than as a container from which a reader extracts a message. Right? So we're actively involved with the text in the mode of strategy, and this is a common way of formulating experience and semiotics in the post-structuralist tradition is that everything is about power and strategies and tools, right? That objects have their own unique strategies, their own unique facts of discourse that make them what they are, allow them to act in such and such a way. And he really wants to look at the reader in this way, as suspended. He wants to substitute one question, what does this sentence mean, for another, more operational question, what does this sentence do? And what the sentence does is give the reader something and then take it away, drawing him on with the unredeemed promise of its return. An observation about the sentence as an utterance, its refusal to yield a declarative statement, has been transformed into an account of its experience, not being able to get a fact out of it, its resistance, in other words. It is no longer an object, a thing in itself, but an event, something that happens to and with the participation of the reader. And it is this event, this happening, all of it, and not anything that could be said about it or any information one might take away from it, that is, I would argue, the meaning of the sentence. Right? So meaning is something much more dynamic. It's not the kind of thing that so easily is fit into a theoretical box, or that one can use a sort of programmatic, systematic framework to approach a text with. There's always going to be historical accounts and factors of intrusion, as he calls it, where we're going to have to look at reading as an encounter, as an event, as an occurrence. These are all words that he's using. And key for Fish that differentiates him from the structuralists, because the structuralists are going to say that the reading experience is encoded in the text, and there are parameters structurally embedded in the text that yield certain responses. And this is essentially a one-to-one correspondence. And our job is to sort of walk this back, kind of like the phenomenologists are doing with experience, and figure out what are the structural preconditions that are allowing me to have the sort of experience I am having, to allow myself to have the sort of reading I'm having. And Fish is very similar to this, but important for him that is part and parcel of the poststructuralist tradition, is that a syntactical uncertainty remains unresolved. So we can't reduce the text to a mere syntactical structure, but there's also a dynamic mediating happening that causes the reader to recursively affect the text that they are reading. So the text itself is not some simple structure, but because words have no a priori meaning apart from the meaning that they gain as a result of our reading, it's not as if the text just sits there. If it ever does have a meaning, it is the result of a dynamic event that we engage with the text with. Therefore, he wants to go away from this idea of a rigorous and disinterested asking of questions and reading. He wants to look at response as a category that includes any and all of the activities provoked by a string of words, the projection of syntactical and or lexical probabilities, their subsequent occurrence or non-occurrence, attitudes towards persons or things or ideas referred to, the reversal or questioning of those attitudes, and much more. Right? So we're trying to look and see how the reader responds to the terms in a textual flow. And key here is the idea of perspective, which is coming from, amongst many philosophers, Nietzsche, historically, right? Nietzsche has this perspectival method whereby truth is an effect, a tool, and a strategy, and is the result of a particular perspective. There is no appraisal of truth independent of some perspective which deems it true. Therefore, Fish states that the reader is given a perspective from which to view the statement. And given is important. So the reader is in part thrown into a perspective that they didn't necessarily ask for. And what Fish is trying to do is sort of archaeologically dig up the facts of that perspective, the enveloping facts that would guarantee reading. And he wants to forestall that idea of a guarantee. I think Fish is firmly committed to the idea, as are thinkers like Joyce, for example, that there is nothing simple or easy about language, and nothing guaranteed either. He wants to look and see that the value of his procedure is predicated on the idea of meaning as an event, something that is happening between the words and in the reader's mind, something not visible to the naked eye, but which can be made visible, or at least palpable, by the regular introduction of a searching question. What does this do? And I think here it's really helpful to bring in Gabriel Rengley from his book Joyce's Theory, Hermeneutic Ethics in Derrida, Lacan, and Finnegan's Wake, where he says in his introduction, a reading is a situated encounter with a text, which draws on this text to inflect its own situation. The important thing about decisions made in reading, and Fish would agree here that reading is about decisions being made, is that they are demanded but not spelled out by the text, whilst being impacted but not programmed by our concrete situation. Right? So there's not a one-to-one overcoding as if our situation wholly accounted for, and like if we just had enough empirical information about our situation, we could then walk back our interpretation and concretely ground it in the signs of the text. No, there is a certain ambiguity between the text and the reader that prevents us from doing that in such an easy way. But it is spelled out insofar as meaning is found between the lines. So we do have to actually concretely approach lines which we do read and, which can be copied in books and given to other people. So there is a textual artifact here. But what's important for Fish is understanding that the artifact doesn't wholly account for the reading. He says that every linguistic experience is affected and pressuring, right? Affected because it is concerned with affect. It yields certain affects and sensations to us, experiences, and also pressuring, right? Linguistic experiences come from without and they pressure us, but they also come from within and impel us outwards to something new. As such, the category of sense, right, of something making sense, we say in common parlance, that makes sense. This is something that is made, it is created, and it's something that can be easily made, Fish says. Even from the most banal statements, with the least context possible, we can make sense very easily out of things that would seem to not be able to make sense out of. And the perfect example here is Noam Chomsky, who claims to make a meaningless sentence. Colorless green ideas sleep furiously. Right? So in terms of English, this is grammatically correct, but semantically it is nonsensical. And Chomsky is trying to make a distinction here that we can have something that is syntactically correct, but semantically nonsensical. That there cannot be any sense made out of this. And Fish and I both deny Chomsky's claim that this is something we cannot make sense out of. For even then, as I spoke the sentence to you, certain associations arise. Maybe the color green pops into your head, or you imagine sleeping in your own bed, or you imagine, or in fact are actively engaged in trying to figure out the sentence. That's an activity and something that concretely speaks to us. Now, it's not discrete. Of course, we couldn't fit this to a referent in the world because colorless and green are contradictory. Green is a color, and colorless would seem to negate that green. So we're really left without a referent which is discrete in the world, which we could tack this syntactical expression onto. And yet, nevertheless, we can make some kind of meaning out of it if we are shifting what we mean by meaning. That meaning is an activity that has to do with affect, and it's not just an analytical experience. Fish says the problem is simply that most methods of analysis operate at so high a level of abstraction that the basic data of the meaning experience are slighted and or obscured. Right? So the problem is we're way too general with the way we approach texts. That may seem crazy. You may, read some of these older biblical exegesis, for example, and you may say, wow, these are very detailed. This doesn't seem general at all. But Fish maintains that all of these readings that don't take into account the reader have entirely failed to take account of the active process by which meaning has been created. It assumes that the reader can effectively be substituted for any other, and that all we are concerned with when we're interpreting a text is the words on the page. But the Fish says, no, this is just not true. If we actually look at what it means to read, we see that all the time we are actively engaging with texts. So as Fish gets deeper into his analysis, he says, okay, we have to realize that all literature generates an expectation that impels the reader forward. And impels is important, right? Because it's not expelling one. It's not as if it's coming from without, but rather the force of the reading is coming from some sort of compulsion that is within the reader that tells one that something must happen. Therefore, the word and its effect are the basic data of the meaning experience, and they will direct our description of that experience because they direct the reader. So what Fish is doing here is he's trying to describe. He's not trying to judge. He's trying to detail out what are the sort of impressions that we're getting from the text. And importantly, try to index them to the moments in the text where they're coming from. Try to figure out what is the logic of the text that is giving me this reading experience, and also what are the logics of my own reading experience. So it's not merely just as if we're trying to get back to the text and eliminate the reading experience. In fact, ideally, we want these to be on the same plane, occupying the same space, the text and the reader engaging with the text, because they're so reciprocally intertwined. Therefore, in contrast to Wimsatt and Beardsley, these very famous new critics who talk of the affective fallacy, that they want to be concerned with what the text is, not what it does, Fish contends that what it does is what it means. That meaning is an action, an activity, a happening, and we can't talk about an in itself to the text. He says, what I am suggesting is that there is no direct relationship between the meanings of a sentence, paragraph, novel, poem, and what its words mean. Or to put the matter less provocatively, the information an utterance gives, its message, is a constituent of, but certainly not to be identified with, its meaning. It is the experience of an utterance, all of it, and not anything that could be said about it, including anything I could say, that is its meaning. So meaning is equivalent to experience for Fish, because that's the only way we get meaning, is by experiencing a text, and experiencing thinking about a text, experiencing explicating or talking about a text. All of this is actively happening, and it is spelled out, but not exhausted by the text, right? We cannot find a one-to-one correspondence or a direct relationship between the meanings of a sentence and what the words mean. Because words are the sort of elements that he's choosing here. They're the basic constituents, but they don't just simply add up to a realistic picture. Everything is always sort of bustling up against each other and creating certain problems that the reader is working through. And key for Fish is this idea that it is impossible to mean the same thing in two or more different ways, although we tend to think that it happens all the time. So really, for Fish, there are no such thing as synonyms, because every different word has a slightly different meaning precisely because it brings to mind different associations, different affects. It is literally a different word. It has different letters that constitute it. It is phonetically different. So all the time, we need to be looking at the individual experiences through which a reader lives and understanding that their reader is irrevocably inflected by that unique experience. And that even if two readers are, for example, from a very similar socioeconomic or religious background, still their experiences will be irrevocably different. And the differences are really what is most interesting for Fish, because he wants to see literature as something that we inhabit and that we dwell in. And we form it in this process of dwelling, thinking of living in a dwelling, right? When you live in a home, you actively change it to suit your needs better. And this is what we do with the book. We like to think that we don't do this. We like to think that we leave no trace. But really, I mean, this is a Derridian idea that we always leave our trace. And so do the voices of the text. So do the marks that leave behind a cinder of some kind. Right? We're calling to attention memories. We're calling to attention feelings and associations and reactions. For Fish, to consider the utterance apart from the consciousness receiving it is to risk missing a great deal of what is going on. It is a risk which analysis in terms of doings and happenings works to minimize. So that's what he's doing, right? An analysis in terms of doings and happenings. So things that the reader does, things that the text does, and things that happen to the reader and things that happen to the text. And this involves a consciousness which is receiving and also sending signals, right? Also proferring meanings to the text and seeing whether or not they fit in. And an advantage of his method, he says, is its ability to deal with sentences and words that don't mean anything in the sense of not making sense. So we might think again of our Chomsky sentence, colorless green ideas sleep furiously. In an experiential analysis, the sharp distinction between sense and nonsense, with the attendant value judgments in the talk about truth content, is blurred, because the place where sense is made or not made is the reader's mind rather than the printed page or the space between the covers of a book. And I think this is a really important realization that Fish is hitting on here. I, again, am thinking of the Rengley quote from earlier, that the text does not program our response, that, it is in part structurated by our response, but it's not restricted per se. There are always holes in every text, and the reader is actively creating the meaning, right? Because a text doesn't have any opinions about itself. It doesn't have any thoughts. It doesn't really have any ideas at all. A text is just ink blots on a page at the end of the day. And if the text is anything as some sort of coherent idea with a narrative, well, narrative is a concept. It's something that we make in our heads. So all of these really come alive as coherent entities, as something that we can sort of tangibly talk about, even in the abstract, in the sort of realm of ideas, so to speak. This is something that we have to do as readers. So while a statement like the Chomsky statement might be meaningless as a statement corresponding to a state of affairs in the real world, right? We couldn't attach a referent to this statement. Nevertheless, its refusal to mean in that discursive way creates the experience that is its meaning. And an analysis of that experience, rather than of logical content, is able to make sense of one kind, experiential sense, out of nonsense. Right? So the sense of experience, the fact that a text assails us as such with meaning, that is a sense of its own. Therefore, for Fish, his category of response is very wide. He says that I include not only tears, prickles, and other psychological symptoms, but all the precise mental operations involved in reading, including the formulation of complete thoughts, the performing and regretting of acts of judgment, the following and making of logical sequences, and also, because my insistence on the cumulative pressures of the reading experience puts restrictions on the possible responses to a word or phrase. Right? That's important, that reading is always a cumulative pressure that is moving us in a predictable direction. Now, there are always zones of ambiguity, but what's important for Fish is that there is something palpable and tangible about reading, but not objective. He says that the objectivity of the text is an illusion, and moreover a dangerous illusion, because it is so physically convincing. The illusion is one of self-sufficiency and completeness. A line of print or a page or a book is so obviously there, it can be handled, photographed, or put away, that it seems to be the sole repository of whatever value and meaning we associate with it. This is, of course, the unspoken assumption behind the word content. The line or page or book contains everything. And yet the great merit, from his point of view, of kinetic art, which I would contend that a text is kinetic art, is that it forces you to be aware of it as a changing object, and therefore no object at all, and also to be aware of yourself as correspondingly changing. Kinetic art does not lend itself to a static interpretation because it refuses to stay still and doesn't let you stay still either. And is this not true for texts? Texts do not stay still. Texts change every time you read them. In its operation, it makes inescapable the actualizing role of the observer. Literature is a kinetic art, but the physical form it assumes prevents us from seeing its essential nature, even though we so experience it. The availability of a book to the hand, its presence on the shelf, its listing in a library catalog, all of these encourage us to think of it as a stationary object. Somehow, when we put a book down, we forget that while we were reading, it was moving, pages turning, lines receding into the past, and forget too that we were moving with it. Crucial for Fish, because of this, is the idea that texts are temporal, that they come to us only bit by bit, moment by moment. And because these moments are experienced by a particular reader, the uniqueness of the individual causes generalization about response to be impossible. And this is a big problem for literary criticism. It is hard to generalize our responses to say that this is what the text is trying to say, because of the fact that we are structured by, and we also structure our experience, right? It is an object that uniquely suits us, that is uniquely accessible to us, and when we write about our experiences, we have to do some work of mediation, right? We have to try to make up for the gaps of expectations and preferences of our audience. So really, Fish says that if anything, his model of interpretation would have to approach a literary competence model. And literary competence is this idea of the expectations and tools that a reader has as a member of a community that allows for them to make sense of language. That it corresponds more or less to the internal mechanisms which allow us to process and understand and produce sentences that we have never before encountered. His model would therefore be a spatial model in the sense that it would reflect a system of rules pre-existing and indeed making possible any act linguistically at all. This is discourse. This is what discourse analysis does. It proceeds in terms of the system of rules all speakers share. And insofar as these rules are constraints on production, establishing boundaries within which utterances are labeled normal, deviant, impossible, and so on, they will also be constraints on the range and even the direction of response. That is, they will make response to some extent predictable and normative. So Fish brings in this idea of a regularizing constraint, and that this is what the text is doing. It is actively engaging with norms, and therefore normalizing. Think of a normal distribution in math. It is trying to normalize readers, trying to truncate their experience. And in a sense, therefore, the text is acting against the reader. It is trying to mitigate, because this is how writers tend to write, is they ignore the reading experience. They want to try to whittle down the reader and try to get them to acquiesce to their goals, to their opinions and ideas and the validity of their concepts. So Fish wants to look at the temporary adoption of inappropriate strategies as itself a response to text. That these strategies, which may be inappropriate to even approach the reading experiences, are often the sort of mainstay of the way that we approach texts. Fish says, for me, reading and comprehension in general is an event, no part of which is to be discarded. In that event, which is the actualization of meaning, the deep structure plays an important role, but it is not everything. For we comprehend not in terms of the deep structure alone, but in terms of a relationship between the unfolding in time of the surface structure and a continual checking of it against our projection, always in terms of surface structure, of what the deep structure will reveal itself to be, right? The deep structure would be the sort of meaning that we think is hidden in the text, that is inherent. And then the sort of surface level unfolding is our experience. And we want to claim that these are different, but Fish is really just invoking them here as a sort of convention. They're not things that he actually believes are separable in this way. He continues, when the final discovery has been made and the deep structure is perceived, all the quote-unquote mistakes, the positing on the basis of incomplete evidence of deep structures that failed to materialize, will not be canceled out. They have been experienced. They have existed in the mental life of the reader, and they mean. Therefore, Fish wants to theorize what he calls not an ideal or an idealized reader, but an informed reader, which is to say, one who is a competent speaker of the language out of which the text is built up, and is in full possession of semantic knowledge that allows for them to process texts. They are experiencers situated in discourses, familiar with devices, genre, tone, plot structure. All of this creates terms of potential and probable response, the significance and value that a reader can be expected to attach to the idea. So the reader is an informed reader who is neither an abstraction nor any one actual lived reader, because competence is a communal, societal question. What are the conditions that structure a community's sense of saying that this is the proper way you should speak or react to speech? So there are a series of constraints and assumptions and operations performed on one who is an actual reader as a subset of a community. And Fish wants to respond to those who would say that this is solipsistic, because he's concerned with the reader more than the artifact, that therefore this is just some solipsism, some relativism. He says, well, I have argued above that it is dangerous and self-validating to posit objectivity. He says, I suppose that what I'm saying is that I would rather have an acknowledged and controlled subjectivity than an objectivity which is finally an illusion. That his method is radically historical, wherein the critic has the responsibility of becoming not one, but a member of informed readers, each of whom will be identified by a matrix of political, cultural, and literary determinants. This matrix is discourse. This plurality of informed readers implies a plurality of informed reader aesthetics, or no aesthetic at all, right? Different perspectives that we use to appraise a text. A method of analysis that yields a structured description of response has built into it an operational criterion, right? These are the expected operations, the ways, the rules of the road, so to speak. And the question is not how good it is, any of these criterion, but how does it work? And both question and answer are framed in terms of local conditions, which include local notions of literary value. Therefore, he concludes that my method allows for no aesthetic and fixing of value. In fact, it is oriented away from evaluation and towards description. It is difficult to say on the basis of its results that one work is better than another, or even that a single work is good or bad. And more basically, it doesn't permit the evaluation of literature as literature, apart from advertising or preaching or propaganda or entertainment, right? So literature is an extremely wide range of media. It's not simply the way that we typically think of book-bound literature. As a report of a stimulus-response relationship, it provides no way to distinguish between literary and other effects, except perhaps for the components which go into one or the other and no one. He asks rhetorically, well then, when does one come to the point? The answer is never, or no sooner than the pressure to do so becomes unbearable psychologically. Coming to the point is the goal of a criticism that believes in content, in extractable meaning, in the utterance as a repository. Coming to the point fulfills a need that most literature deliberately frustrates if we open ourselves to it, the need to simplify and close. Coming to the point should be resisted, and in its small way, this method will help you to resist. Right? So this is a really radical method. It touts resistance as an active strategy of reading, and we have a responsibility to language in all of its aspects. Attention is shifted away from the message to its reception, and therefore from the object to the reader. This is very similar to the medium is the message, right? That we also see featured in Baudrillard. Fish says, my insistence is that everything counts and that something analyzable and significant is always happening. And that this is not a method, strictly speaking, because neither its results nor its skills are transferable. Its results are not transferable because there's no fixed relationship between formal features and response. Reading has to be done every time, and I might add done anew. And its skills are not transferable because you can't hand it over to someone and expect him at once to be able to use it. It's not portable. It is, in essence, a language sensitizing device. And as the ing in sensitizing implies, its operation is long-term and never-ending, never coming to the point. Moreover, its operations are interior. It has no mechanism except for the pressuring mechanism of the assumption that more is going on in language than we consciously know. And of course, the pressure of this assumption must come from the individual whose untrained sensitivity it is challenging. Becoming good at the method means asking the question, what does that blank do? With more and more awareness of the probable and hidden complexity of the answer. That is, with a mind more and more sensitized to the workings of language. In a peculiar and unsettling, to theorists at least, way, it is a method which processes its own user, who is also its only instrument. It is self-sharpening, and what it sharpens is you. In short, it does not organize materials, but transforms mind. The method then remains faithful to its principles. It has no point of termination. It is a process. It talks about experience, and it is an experience. Its focus is effects, and its result is an effect. In the end, the only unqualified recommendation I can give is that it works. So that being said, that is it for this lecture. I hope that my explication and reading of selected passages of this essay has helped make sense of Fish's ideas. I think this is a great essay for every reader and thinker of all kinds to read. I think it's super important for really contextualizing and dealing with and coming to bear against the biases that we bring as individuals to our societies and to the texts that are so central to our societies. You can check out any of my other lectures I've done here on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can also become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks if you'd just like to donate to the channel, because it really helps me in being able to purchase the books necessary to bring y'all content, and I appreciate everyone who donates. But no pressure. Care about yourself first. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.